All right, trying to find a. All right, trying to get my idea about how to do this. So this is chapter 17. I've already made a few videos about the small intestines and the large intestines. So I'm going to try to make a study guide for the beginning part of it. Now, just to start off with, this thing that we call the digestive system, the main part of it is a tube called the alimentary canal, sometimes called the GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, but the alimentary canal is the main way I'll try to refer to it this time. Now, it's interesting in the fact that whatever is inside of it is considered an external environment. And so think about this alimentary canal, it starts at the mouth, it ends at the anus, and it is a tube that when I eat or drink something, as it goes through this tube, it's going to pass several areas where special things are going to happen. Certain accessory organs are going to dump in enzymes or chemicals that are going to help start breaking down this food that we've eaten, this nutrients that we've eaten, into its component parts. And if we skip down to where this building blocks is, the building blocks that we're talking about is the one just above it. Sugars are going to be the building blocks for the carbohydrates. Again, a monosaccharide, the main one is glucose. And then we have amino acids. These are the building blocks of proteins. Proteins are long chains of amino acids, and we have to continually, as it passes through, there's going to be different areas that are going to break down those because they can be thousands of amino acids long. Then nucleotides, these are the building blocks of nucleic acids, RNA and DNA. The NA in those are that because of nucleic acids. So nucleotides are the building blocks of nucleic acids. And then we have fatty acids and glycerol. And those two are the building blocks of triglycerides, which are our main dietary lipid. And we'll talk more about the lipids in the next chapter. But that's what this GI tract, this alimentary canal, is doing as we go back up here to this little part here. It's kind of weird to think that it's the external environment. But if I take an apple and I eat it and I chew it, I mix it with saliva, I start having some breakdown of things. It's going to go in through the esophagus down to the stomach, where it's going to be held and mixed with hydrochloric acid and this thing called pepsin that starts breaking down some of the peptide bonds inside of proteins, which help get it smaller. But then it's going to go into the small intestines, and there's where the digestion or the breakdown really starts. But as it's passing through and these chemicals get put into it, that's where these building blocks, we break these chemicals down to their building blocks and absorb them. And that what we don't absorb passes through us and we release as feces. But it was the apple. And so as I chew that apple and I eat it, my body's going to break down the good and absorb it. And then what I can't absorb or don't need, I expel. But whatever's been expelled has never truly entered my body. It's always been an external environment, which again is kind of a weird thing to think about. Now, in digestion, we're talking about two types. Now, all digestion is it just simply means it's breaking something down. So in the chemistry portion in 210, when you looked at this is what they would call catabolism. All right, and we even learned it as that's what digestion is, catabolism. It's the breakdown of things. And there's two ways this can happen. One way is going to be what we look at here as mechanical digestion. This is going to occur in the mouth. It's the only place that this happens is the mouth. And that's why we really should chew our food probably better than we do. We should chew it, I'm not going to say like my grandmother used to say, I think it was 60 times, but we should chew it a lot more than we do because it really helps with the next one, which is the chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is when I'm going to have enzymes that are going to help break it down into smaller and smaller parts. But just for instance, they kind of work together. Even though mechanical digestion is only in the mouth, the oral cavity, the reason beans are the musical fruit is because we have a problem with the chemical digestion of the proteins in there. And so the mechanical digestion, if we chew those beans more and really try to use the mechanical digestion portion, the mechanical breakdown, it makes the chemical digestion easier and they don't become as musical, if you get my drift. Oh, that's a bad pun. Anyway, hope you got that. So the digestive system is what's going to carry out both this mechanical and chemical digestion, but it will also, at the same point in time, it will also do the ingestion, which means that I'm going to eat it and it's going to bring it in. Propulsion, which is going to move it along. Absorption, which is where I'm going to take all of the good that I can out and pull it into my body. And then finally, defecation, which is getting rid of the byproducts. Now, the digestive system consists of the alimentary canal and the accessory organs that are alongside of it. This is a picture of it as it is packed into our body. The alimentary canal, as I said, is what the entire tube is called. The accessory organs we're going to look at as it goes through. The accessory organs, salivary glands are a big one. And then the big three are going to be right at the start of the small intestines. The liver, gallbladder, and pancreas are the big three as far as accessory organs. But salivary glands are also very important. All right, third time's a charm. We'll see what we can do with that. So again, this is the alimentary canal as it is laid out. If I want to look at it, I've got where the mouth with the tongue, the esophagus goes down to the stomach. Right after the stomach, the small intestine begins, and this is where the big three are going to be: gallbladder, pancreas, the liver, which is not listed there. But the small intestines is only called small because of the diameter. It is a very large, or a long tube, I should say. It is the majority of the entire length of this whole thing. Small is only in reference to the diameter. And then we have the large intestines, again, which is only in reference to the diameter, but the large intestines has a larger diameter. It is shorter than the small intestines. And its main job is to pull out as much water and any of the minerals, the ions that we need to. But this guy right here, the small intestines, is the main one. It's where most of the work is being done. So all throughout the alimentary canal, there are 4 layers. We've got the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa. Now, the muscularis, which is the innermost, this is what we looked at as the simple columnar cells back in 210. It is going to be what is in contact with the food and the substances in order to try and absorb it. Just underneath the mucosa is the well-named submucosa, which means underneath the mucosa. And this is going to be a special layer. This layer is going to have a lot of blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatic tissue. This is where the reflexes are really going to be taking control, things that are monitoring the nervous system, monitoring what the chemical content is, as well as just simply where it is located along this whole tract. So there's a lot of things that are going to be done and controlled through this submucosa. Then we have the muscularis, which is a band of smooth muscle throughout the entire length. It is basically 2 layers, a circular, an inner circular layer, and then an outer longitudinal layer. And this is going to help the movements that go through it. And I will point out that there is one exception to this where the stomach has 3 layers. There is another third additional layer called the oblique layer. And that's one of the main ways to tell if we're looking at something inside the stomach, because you'll see that there's 3 layers to it. And then finally, the serosa, which is the outer covering. It is generally a pretty thin layer. It's protection. Now, these serosa underneath or inferior to the diaphragm, which means it would be in the abdominal pelvic cavity, the serosa in that area is called the visceral peritoneum. All right, so just to give you an idea, the serosa is the outermost layer, but in that specific area, the serosa is referred to as the visceral peritoneum. Now, this slide just gives a little view of the breakdown of things. We're going to look at a lot of the stuff it's talking about here, and so we'll get to that. But these kind of show the 4 layers of the alimentary canal. Now, throughout this alimentary canal, the muscularis, the muscular layer, is all about trying to move things. Some of the movements are going to simply be trying to move things from the start to the end. And those are called propelling movements. Those are the ones here on the bottom that are the propelling movements. They're the ones that would commonly be referred to as peristalsis. Most of us have heard of that. So peristalsis is just simply moving things from start to finish, trying to go from the beginning to the end. So they're called propelling movements. Now, the one that is kind of new, but is a pretty important one, is called the mixing movements. Now, the example is called segmentation. Now, what happens here on segmentation, I've got the digested material, the things I'm trying to break down, and my especially small intestines, is going to constrict on either side of it, forming this little package. And then the muscle in here is going to basically knead this. And so it's going to mix and twist and turn and push things back and forth. And what it's trying to do is mix the digestive enzymes in with this. It's basically fluid at this point, in case you don't know. It's basically fluid at this point, so the digestive enzymes get put in there, and then this thing called segmentation, which is a form of a mixing movement, is going to cause it to slosh back and forth and actually really intertwine those enzymes with the food in order to break the chemicals down. Now, we also have 2 forms of innervation, obviously, here. We have the sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. And so parasympathetic innervation is going to be stimulatory. This is normal. Most people have heard of the sympathetic nervous system as rest and digest, but most people also have not heard, I don't know if that came out right, but most people don't use this phrase for the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic is usually listed as the rest and digest, because the main purpose for the parasympathetic here is the GI tract, is this alimentary canal. So it's stimulatory to it, where the sympathetic nervous system, when it kicks on, is inhibitory to it. Again, remember that just about everything, and I'm only saying just about because I can't think of anything that doesn't fall into this, but I'm always leaving that door open, that whatever the sympathetic nervous system stimulates, the parasympathetic inhibits. And whatever the parasympathetic stimulates, the sympathetic inhibits. So remember that kind of as it goes along. I hope that helped. I hope it didn't confuse. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is mainly going to be using the adrenaline. So you can think of this adrenaline rush is going to be doing this. The parasympathetic is going to be controlling these by way of cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. Now, inside that, the GI tract, they're going to have 2 neural plexuses, and they are going to be, one's called the submucosal plexus and one's called the myenteric. Now remember, my means muscle, so you should have an idea that the myenteric is going to be about the movement of the GI tract or the alimentary canal. The submucosal plexus is going to be controlling the mucus and the different hormones and enzymes that are going to be produced. And so this is going to be moving things along and mixing things up. This is going to be in charge of controlling the secretions that are going to be put into it. Remember again, parasympathetic is going to increase the digestive system. Sympathetic inhibit the digestive system. I don't know, this picture always kind of freaks me out a little bit. Just seems like someone's yelling at me, but I'm assuming everyone here knows the mouth. I hope that you also know these parts. So the lip is the outside part, the hard palate, the roof of your mouth, whereas bony is the hard palate. The part of your mouth that doesn't have bony backing in it is called the soft palate. The little thing that hangs down in the back of your throat is called the uvula. I'm not worried about the tonsils in this picture, but hopefully you'd know the tongue. This little thing called the lingual pharynx, it is the little attachment point to the tongue, to the bottom of your mouth. And it is, again, just a little FYI, when I was a kid, Kiss, I was growing up in the 70s, and Kiss was actually just coming on the scene, and Gene Simmons had this long tongue, and everybody thought that he cut this to do it. I don't think he did, so don't try it. But anyway, that was kind of when I learned this. It was kind of one of those things like, oh, that's what that's called. Now this goes down to the lower lip, and all this part's talking about is the vestibule, which is the space between where your cheeks and lips are and then your gums are. Now, in 210, you learned of a group of muscles called the muscles of mastication. Remember, mastication is simply the mechanical breakdown of food. We talked about that a minute ago. It is the scientific name for mechanical digestion. As you do that, it's going to mix the food with saliva. It makes it easier to swallow. And so, that's a pretty important thing. If you've ever heard of the saltine challenge, you'll know that it is important for saliva in order to swallow. But we will talk about that shortly. So on this one, cheeks form the lateral walls of the mouth, where lips form the opening. One thing to know is the lips have a higher amount of sensory receptors than most areas of the body. This little part here, because part of it, I guess, is to judge temperature, but also the texture of food and whatever. It is one of those things. The tongue is a pretty thick muscle. I jokingly say it's a thick muscle because most people use it more than they should. I've always heard the thing, we've got two ears and one mouth. We're supposed to listen twice as much, but I can tell you that I don't always follow that. So, just pointing that out. So the lingual pharynx is what we talked about that attaches to the base of the tongue, or the tongue to the floor of the mouth. But also, when we talked about, when you think about the tongue, you think about taste buds, and we commonly refer to all of these bumps that are on our tongues as taste buds, but they're really called papilla. The taste buds are actually deep inside of there. They're much smaller. But the papilla on our tongue are those little bumps you feel. If you've ever felt a cat's tongue, the cat's tongue is much more rough, and that's because they have larger papilla. And again, the tonsils, we're going to talk about the tonsils in a minute. You'll see those a little later on. So the palate, we said the palate forms the roof of the oral cavity. We have a hard palate and a soft palate. The uvula, as we said before, the uvula is going to be part of, that uvula here is part of the extension of the soft palate. Now, teeth, we discussed a little bit about teeth. Understand teeth are the hardest structures in the body, particularly the enamel. I want you to know that you have both primary and secondary teeth. The primary teeth are called deciduous, which means baby. The secondary teeth are just simply called permanent teeth. I am not requiring you to know the numbers of these. You should know the names of some of them. You should know incisors, molars. You should kind of know a little bit about those and premolars, but this isn't something I'm going to ask about on this chapter. Now, again, what I will make sure you know is that this enamel, the outer part of the tooth, is the strongest, is the hardest material that the body produces. Again, not going over the clinical application. So this is kind of a refresher course. The cheeks and the lips and the tongue, these are all, the palate, so these are all parts of the mouth, and it gives a description of what they do. I mean, I would think you would know this without having to look at it, but you should make sure you know it, because that is definitely fair game for a test. All right, so again, kind of messed up on something here. I was talking about the parotid gland, which the parotid, paraotic means around the ear. And so this is the one that's actually around the ear. It's the largest of the three salivary glands. And if you've ever seen something and you had that feeling of your cheeks kind of puckering up for it, little lemon heads and stuff like that will do it to people. That's your parotid gland getting ready to deal with that. The submandibular gland, the fact that it's called the submandibular gland should give you an idea where it is. It's below the mandible. And then the sublingual, lingual meaning tongue, sublingual means below the tongue. So those are the three major salivary glands. Now, again, you do need to know a little bit about those, but it is all good. Now, I wanted to jump ahead of this almost. So the salivary glands are made up of two types of cells. Serous cells, which are the ones that produce the different types of digestive enzyme. One of them is called salivary amylase. It's not the only one, but it is one of them. It is what's going to help break down these large carbohydrates. I hope whenever you see the word starch here, I hope that you understand that means a large carbohydrate that plants have used as storage. And then glycogen is the large carbohydrate that animals use as storage. These are both complex carbohydrates. And it starts breaking them down. The mucus cells are going to secrete mucus. And that is, anytime we talk about mucus, I have to point out that while it sounds gross, it is absolutely vital. This is what allows things to move through smoothly. So again, this is the breakdown of the three major parasalivary glands. Parotid around the ear, the largest. Submandibular is going to be underneath the mandible, and sublingual underneath the tongue. And so I'm not worried about you knowing exactly what all of these do and are. I just want you to know the basics of those. This is a picture of it. This right here is the parotid. Again, it's around the ear. Submandibular, sublingual. These are pictures of the different ones. I am not going to be using these, but I will point out that you can see from left to right the parotid, which is mainly serous. It's going to be producing mainly just saliva, where submandibular is going to be across. You're going to get about half and half of the serous and mucus. And then the sublingual is finally mainly mucus. Now, the pharynx, which we looked at in the respiratory system, is behind the oral cavity. It is going to extend from the nasal cavity to the esophagus. The pharynx has three portions: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, laryngenopharynx, depending on the specific area where it was behind. Now, the pharynx and the esophagus do not have any process of food digestion. Nothing about breaking anything down. It is simply a passageway. And they have very muscular walls, and those muscles are there to help in swallowing. The pharynx connects the nasal and oral cavities and can be divided into the following parts, like we talked about. We've seen this a couple of times. Just to kind of point it out here. All right, so it skipped over. I'm not going to go back and point those out. Everybody should know those. So in swallowing, there's 3 stages. The voluntary stage, which is saliva is mixed and chewed with food, forming a bolus. Second stage, that's going to be the bolus. Again, I should have told you the word bolus, this word here, and hopefully I won't switch a stupid thing again. This word here, bolus, means is the name for the food that we eat and chewed and have mixed with saliva. So we swallow this bolus and it goes into our stomach. So the stages of it, the first stage is just simply chewing. The second stage is where most of the things happen. The food is going to be pushed back towards the back of our mouth. You're not even going to pay attention to it. You do it automatically. When that happens, there's going to be a reflex where the soft palate and the uvula raise, and that protects the nasal cavity of food going back into it. Just like the epiglottis closes off the larynx, that's what the soft palate and the uvula do. And so it makes sure the food goes into the epiglottis, or the esophagus. So there's a process that goes along, the swallowing reflex. But once it gets into the esophagus, then it's the third stage, and it's going to be moved by peristalsis into the stomach. So this goes over the processes of it. But really, it's chewing, stage 1. Stage 2 is all kinds of processes, trying to get the food towards the back of the cavity and then down. We're going to have the soft palate close the upper part, the epiglottis close the trachea, and then the food is pushed into the esophagus. And at that point, stage 3 happens, which is simply peristalsis. The esophagus is a muscular passageway from the pharynx to the stomach. It's 25 centimeters long. You don't have to know that. You do need to know it goes from the pharynx to the stomach. It penetrates the diaphragm through a little opening called the esophageal hiatus. Remember, that's where the esophagus is not there. So the esophageal hiatus, there's an opening. A hiatus means it's not there. So the esophagus fits into this little opening. It's going to have mucus glands, which are just going to have basic mucus that's secreted. And at the bottom of it, there will be a sphincter that is going to be the junction between the esophagus and the stomach. On this, it calls it the lower esophageal sphincter. Now, it can also be called the cardiac sphincter. There's a couple of different words to it, but this is what the book uses. And probably since this test is going to be made out of the book, through McGraw-Hill, that's probably what will be given. But I'll try to make sure you see what it is. I believe I'm going to stop the video at the stomach, and I'm going to start up here on another one at 30 minutes. I figure that this is a pretty good place to stop. I hope it all was understandable. But again, I'm going to start here on another video.